Welcome to the MMP 2018 Fall Agricultural Industry Update webinar. My name is Victor Kruger, and I will again be today's session's host. I'm a Senior Vice President of MMP Ltd., which is the insolvency and restructuring arm of MMP LLP. MMP is the 5th largest professional services firm in Canada, with offices from coast to coast. MMP believes in having specialized client groups and has identified 13 business niches that has dedicated employees working in them. Agriculture is one of our largest niches, and we are the only professional services firm with a farm management consulting services group, comprised of professional agrologists and consultants who come to us from extensive agricultural backgrounds. This group supports our other service lines in any ag-related engagements, and in particular, in every agricultural insolvency or restructuring, we bring in our FMC, or Farm Management Consulting Specialist, to provide us with expert advice to a specific situation and, if necessary, to be hands-on in a formal administration. As opposed to prior webinars, this one is not live. We have decided to record the webinar and send it out to you so that you can watch it on your time rather than on our time. Our spring speaker was Eric Olson, who is a partner in our Winnipeg office and leads the MMP FMC group. And in order to showcase our farm management consulting practice, today we have John Lepke as the presenter. He has a Bachelor of Science in Agricultural degree and has spent more than 17 years working with agricultural clients, including 10 years in the ag group of a chartered bank. John keeps his hand in the industry by working on the family farm as needed. With the new format, we don't have the ability to deal with questions while you are watching the presentation. Any questions or comments you may have should be directed to John or myself at the contact information you will find in the presentation material provided, and we will respond to you directly. John, we look forward to your presentation.
Thanks so much, Vic, and thank you all for joining us today. We're going to start off today looking at the ag industry and run through some market fundamentals, look at how the U.S. dollar and U.S. trade affects ag here in Canada, and then look at some of our larger industry groups, commodity groups here that we've got in Canada. So before we start talking about our commodity groups, I thought it would be a good idea just to touch on the market fundamentals that affect agriculture in Canada, what some of those relationships look like, and how you might see those play out in some of the marketplaces and on farmers' fields as we go through the year. So one industry or sector that's somewhat unique in the world is Canada's supply management system. When we're talking supply management, specifically we're looking at dairy, chicken, eggs, and turkey. In those industries, we don't have a typical supply-demand type relationship. We have limited the amount of supply to meet demand, and so in those industries, prices are set and usually in some relation to the cost of production for the farmers involved in those industries, and the ability to participate in those specific enterprises is limited by purchasing quota. That gives you the right or the license to produce that product. So in those industries, farmers really look at controlling costs as the ability to increase production is limited. The other thing we should talk about, is kind of the pricing chain, where prices are actually coming from. As most of you know, commodity-driven markets, guys are price takers, so there isn't a lot of ability to negotiate prices at the farm level. And typically, when we're talking about agriculture, as a general statement, prices are a lot of times driven out of the U.S. Some examples of that are, say, the hog industry prices are really set in the U.S. and then work back up to a Canadian price. And so a lot of the crop prices as well are based in the U.S. and then work their way back to Canada. I'd say the only maybe difference to that would be canola, where we do have a true Canadian price. We've got a futures market here based in Canada. So that's a little insight, when you're thinking about where prices are coming from, just to keep in mind that a lot of times it is coming out of the U.S. And so why is that? And that really is because the U.S. has a huge ag industry, and they drive a lot of the market on a global scale. And so price discovery a lot of times happens based on what's going on in the U.S. just because they are such a huge supplier of agriculture commodities. And I'll give you some examples as we go through here on just how big they are compared to Canada, let's say. So, if we're talking supply-demand, that's more our grain, our hogs, our beef, those kinds of commodities. They follow a more traditional supply-demand curve. And so, typically as supply goes up, your prices are going to drop, and we'll talk about potentially what some of the supplies are looking like in different commodities as we go through the slides. And then conversely, as demand is potentially dropping, then prices might be dropping as well. So, and that leads us kind of to production. Farmers can't really, as we talked about, control pricing. They're price takers, but one thing they can control is production. So for the most part, farmers are all looking to increase or improve their production, make it as efficient as possible, because that's the piece that they can actually control at the end of the day. And then we're going to talk a bunch about trade as we go through these slides. The reason that it's important to Canada is because Canada is a large exporter on the ag commodity side. In fact, since 2011, we're the 5th largest exporter of ag products in the world. So trade with other nations is extremely important for us. Just as some examples, about 50% of our beef gets exported, 70% of our wheat, 70% of our pork, and like 90% of our canola gets exported. So trade and the relationships that we have with other countries is extremely important as we kind of go through these. So I mentioned our relationship a bit with the U.S., and let's talk about that for a second. So on this slide, we're just looking at the relationship between Canadian dollar and the U.S. dollar, and we just kind of mapped it out over the last couple of years here as we've seen. This is a snapshot in time, obviously, but we've seen prices, or pardon me, not prices, but that exchange rate fluctuate up and down over the years. And the reason that's important is as I mentioned, a lot of times prices are discovered in the U.S. and work back to a Canadian price. So the FX definitely has a big impact on that. And lately we've seen some instances where perhaps U.S. grain producers are struggling a little bit more than Canadian, and that really is just due to the fact that we are insulated to a certain extent by our FX. We don't see all those price changes coming at us because we've got the FX to sort of help us through some of those. So if we move on and talk a little bit about trade, I mentioned trade was important. Trade is in the news quite a bit these days, especially when it comes to agriculture. So I'm going to highlight just 2 of the latest trade deals that are happening and how they are impacting our Canadian agriculture industry. The first is the CPTPP. And just as a background, that's 11 countries are involved in this on a trade partnership, and I've listed out who those countries all are. To date, 5 of them have ratified this agreement, and 6 are needed in order for the agreement to come into effect. and it sounds like that's going to happen relatively quickly here. Canada is one of those countries that's ratified it, and the reason that Canada is at the forefront is the sooner that they get access to some of these other markets, the better off it is for Canada and specifically for farmers in Canada. So, and just to give you a bit of a background, these trade agreements, although they're in the news, let's say at certain points in time, they do take a long time to actually work their way through. As you can imagine, negotiating an 11-country deal does take some time. And the implementation is also quite drawn out. What you'll see a lot of times is that even though, you know, these things come into effect, there's some stage-in periods, or there's a long period of time before we see the full effect of these things. So just something to keep in mind, that you might see these things in the news, but the impact might be coming years down the road is typically what happens. So why is the CPTPP important for agriculture? If we're looking at pork, for example, Japanese tariffs of 20% are going to be eliminated on pork products. The Japanese are consumers of high-end cuts. That's what they prefer. And Canada is a good supplier of those. So I know pork producers are really looking forward to getting more access to that market in Japan, as we get paid obviously a premium for the highest end cuts. So that's an important one that's coming through this. Vietnam is another one. They tend to not buy as much of the high-end cuts, but they make up for it in volume. And so 20% of the current tariffs are going to be eliminated there. Continuing on, Japan and Vietnam are also going to greatly reduce tariffs on beef, as well as offal. So those are other opportunities for Canadian producers to take advantage of some of these good trade opportunities. As part of this, we're also looking at dairy markets opening up, another 3.25% to that group that I mentioned before. We likely won't obviously see a lot of fluid product opening up the market. It'll be coming as cheeses and yogurts and some of those types of product, or potentially we'll see it as a further processing type of item where they'll import, let's say, butter and use it to make another product here in Canada. So you won't necessarily see it on the shelf, but it will be entering Canada's food industry. So the next one we're going to talk about is the USMCA. Obviously, this one has been in the news quite a bit recently and had some big impacts on agriculture. So formerly known as NAFTA, they started talking in 2017 and obviously just finished concluding their negotiations here in September. So even between three countries, that took a little while to get that one done. What's really notable here for ag, again, opening up another 3.6% of the Canadian dairy market, which is obviously more than what they would have got from the U.S. side if they would have stayed in TPP. So that was a big one for the Canadian dairy and made lots of headlines in the news there. Again, it's going to be staged over time, and so the immediate impact is not really going to be seen. You're not going to see a lot of American products on the shelf immediately. Most of that 3.6% is kind of like the TPP, where it's for further processing. So they'll be importing dairy goods, but they'll go to processors, and the processors will then transform them into other products, and so you won't necessarily see them on your store shelf. And again, with this one, there's a staging period, and it'll take a bit of time. The other thing that is important is the elimination of that Class 6 and Class 7 milk. That's your skim milk powders and your dye-filtered milk. The Canadian processors were selling that on the international market. which is where the U.S. also sells its product, and so the agreement was made that Canada would eliminate those classes and not necessarily stop selling it, but at least not compete as much as they have with the U.S. The other piece that happened was Canadian chicken, eggs, and turkey markets are also opening up a bit more to the U.S. market. Once we get into the actual commodity groups, I can talk a little bit more about each of these types of things. So as we move into our commodity groups, the first one we're going to touch on is poultry. As I mentioned before, this is in that supply managed sector. So what we're seeing is, prices and consumption are continuing to improve as we go along. The outlook for the industry is pretty steady, pretty good. The next slide, I'll kind of show you what demands are looking like from the consumer side. When we look at this latest trade agreement and how it affects the poultry side, we're seeing, chicken has opened up about 6% of its market. Turkeys another 3.5% under USMCA. So we're seeing, some of the demand for poultry products being filled by the U.S. Again, this is going to take a long time before these actually come into effect, but still something that producers have to be aware of and have to start adjusting for. So if we look at sort of per capita consumption or disappearance over the last 20 years, and we're looking at poultry in particular, chicken, the blue line there has been going up, demand has been increasing. Eggs as well, the yellow line has been going up. So we're seeing good demand for those types of products. Even though, let's say, the USMCA does open things up, the industry up a bit to foreign products, demand is on the rise. So the impact at the farm level really won't be a massive impact, although there is an impact. But to note here, obviously, is that good demand for the chicken proteins, if you want to call them that. And also to note is your beef and your pork are a bit on the downturn domestically. So. If we move on to the dairy sector, again, it's in that supply managed sector. What we've sort of seen as a trend is butter fat is in demand and has continued to increase as we're going through 2018 here. Slowing down to a bit, but still increasing. What the effect has been of that, in our spring update, we said that quota holdings were increasing. Now we're seeing a lot of the provinces sort of make their quota holdings steady or stable, trying to match, obviously, the demand with the supply. So the signals they're giving the dairy farmer is not to expand, is to maybe stay stable for the next while here. And demand really has not been for fluid milk. The demand is coming in the form of butter, cheese, yogurts, ice cream, that sort of product. So the comment on the new pricing formula in the western part of Canada, anyways, the boards have changed the pricing formula to reflect the fact that they want more butter fat. So they've changed their pricing formulas to give dairy farmers more incentive to deliver them butter fat. So we talked a little bit about USMCA already and how it affected the dairy market. That Class 7 milk has started to, or is in the process of being eliminated. It's going to take a little while for that to actually come into effect, but it is coming, so something that dairy farmers do need to plan for. So they're going to be moving less of their product off of the world market pricing and more domestically, and we'll have to wait and see what the impact of that actually is. What we do know is that if they do want to move a similar product to a Class 7, they will have to pay a tariff to the U.S. So it'll be interesting to see exactly how the processors and the producers collaborate together to figure that one out as we move forward here. But overall, dairy is still a pretty strong, stable industry from that perspective. Moving on to crops. In general, I think the fall pricing for crops across Canada is pretty stable. We're not seeing any big increases or big decreases. I'll talk a little bit about seeded acres in a minute. The other piece is crop conditions. I think the big story there is we've had a drought here in the west, and so that's affected yields and quality of certain crops to a certain extent. And so if you're in those affected areas, we'll just have to look and see what the potential impact of that is going to be as we work through those. So if we're looking at trade, a real interesting piece on trade. If we're talking about soybeans, for example, China and the U.S. have been going through a trade war here, and soybeans have been affected by that, where China's been putting tariffs on soybeans. The latest news that we've heard is China's looking at just doing an outright ban on U.S. soybeans. And so what does that mean for Canadians at the end of the day? Well, it provides an opportunity for Canada, to sell more soybeans to China, which is a good thing. And potentially what could happen is we might see more U.S. soybeans moving into Canada because they could potentially be coming in at a lower price. So interesting, again, how all these trade movements and those types of things affect the farmer at the end of the day, and shows how much of a global economy we really are living in. So next I'm just going to roll through sort of, your major crops, your wheat, canola, soybean, and corn, and just a bit of an update on what's happening in each of those. So if we start off with soybeans in Canada, we're looking at probably our second largest soybean crop. It is a bit of a decrease from 2017, about 2.6%, and largely that's just because of the drought conditions that I talked about previously. If we're talking about canola, again, we're looking at a large canola crop coming off. It's about 1.5% down from what we saw last year. Farmers did plant more canola this year, but again, due to drought, we saw those yields coming down. On the wheat side, we're seeing a 3.3% increase over last year. This is largely due to increased acres. In the west, what we've seen is any early maturing crops like wheat did pretty good. They did get some timely rains that were needed, so that production wasn't impacted. Later maturing crops like your corn and your soybeans were impacted. They just didn't get the needed moisture in the last part of the growing season. Talking about corn, we're seeing a bit lower corn production. We're only seeing 13.8 million tons as an estimate for Canada this year. That's about a 2.2% decrease in production, despite about 2.4% increase in acres. So again, we had some impact on yields due to that drought. So I talked a little bit about the U.S. and trade with the U.S. and how big their agriculture sector is, and this slide really just illustrates a little bit of how Canada stacks up to the U.S. on the crop side. If we want to compare corn, let's say, the U.S. had roughly 88 million acres of corn this year versus Canada, we had 3.6 million. So massive difference there when it comes to, let's say, corn, soybeans. We're seeing that same picture, roughly 89 million soybean acres planted in the U.S. versus 7.4 here in Canada. So Wheat is about the only one where we start to come a little bit close at 47 million in the U.S. versus 23.5 here in Canada. So next, I'm just going to move on to a little bit of land, where we've seen land prices going. And really, this slide is interesting because if we're looking at, say, Iowa, and we look at their land price, and then we look at, income from corn in Iowa, we see that relationship where as the income from corn goes up, land prices go up. As it goes down, then land prices tend to follow. And we see that same relationship. I just use Manitoba as an example here, where Manitoba land price does seem to climb along with grain or cash receipts from crops, and the relationship isn't as extreme, I would say, as we see in Iowa, but it's definitely there. So a driver of land prices definitely is the income that you're going to get off of that, and really that's what we're seeing in this slide. Overall, land prices we're seeing continuing to rise. This is the, 16th year that we've seen land prices rising, and this slide is just for the prairies, but would be the same across the country for the most part. Saskatchewan is growing faster than 2016. Alberta and Manitoba are growing a little bit slower, but the average for Canada is an 8.4% increase. The interesting piece I'm looking at here is we're looking at 16 years of land prices increasing. So if you're a farmer that's 40 or under kind of thing, you haven't lived through a time frame where land prices have actually gone down. So interesting, some of the mindsets that could potentially be out there, just given that land prices continue to rise. If we want to look at farm equipment just for a second, these stats are from the U.S., but I'd say they're pretty closely mirrored here in Canada. We're seeing sales of two-wheel drive tractors going up, four-wheel drive tractors going up, and definitely for combines. And this really goes back to production and being able to maximize production and control production. If you've got equipment, that allows farmers to do a better job of controlling that production. One thing to be just cognizant of, though, you can get caught with too much equipment or too big of equipment compared to the number of acres you've got out there. I think there's a sense from a lot of farmers that they need to be ready for the harvest or the seeding, and they need to do it as quickly as they can, and sometimes get caught up in just having too much equipment on their yards compared to what they actually need to do. If we look at hogs, we're projecting a slightly profitable year this year in hogs. Feed is going to be a little bit higher, which is sort of impacting profitabilities. One thing we did see was some big supplies, bigger supplies than what the packers could handle, and so that did drive prices down a bit. We're seeing some big packing plants in the U.S. coming online or about to come online, and so in anticipation of that, there was a large production of hogs out there, and so we saw the supply getting a little bit too high compared to what the demand was. The other piece, again, back to trade, is back to the U.S. and China. As I mentioned before, the price for Canadian hogs is largely set down in the U.S. So as the tariffs have gone on between U.S. and China, that has impacted the hog market, and since we are priced off of the U.S. to a large extent, that has impacted the Canadian price. Not to say that the processors that are selling the pork products here in Canada haven't been able to sell to other markets, but they have not had to pay the higher price, I guess, relative. One thing we should look at, though, is the Asian swine flu. Potential to have a really big impact. It's a devastating disease. If we've talked about PED in the past, and Asian swine flu is one that devastates every age group of swine, I guess, and usually takes about 10 days for it to actually kill a hog. So it is fairly fast-moving and fairly virulent. We're seeing a big increase in China right now, and reports are that we've got quite a few cases. We always want to be careful when we're talking about China. We never exactly know the information that is coming out of that country. One thing interesting, again, if we're talking about scope, and if this Asian swine flu does start impacting China in a big way, if China production drops by 14%, let's say, because of this flu, that equals the exports of every other country in the world. So massive impact, and also shows just how big China actually is in the pork production world. They've got about 433 million head of hogs in China. That represents about 60% of the population in the world. By comparison, Canada's got about 2%. So even though we export a lot, we're still a relatively small player in that industry. And again, if this thing does take off and hits China, we could see pork prices rising quite a bit. So just an interesting slide. I mentioned that for the most part, hogs are going to be profitable. And here we're just highlighting the difference between, say, Manitoba and Alberta. The difference really comes down to the fact that Manitoba feeds more of a corn and a soybean ration, which are currently at a bit of a lower price compared to Alberta, that typically feeds more of a barley, wheat, and canola meal ration. So for the most part, the industry we're looking at will make a profit this year, but there are some regions that potentially are going to be impacted by this and not be profitable. And this slide just really highlights profit margin as we're working through the years here. We're going back all the way to 2009. We're seeing, some profits here in 2018, obviously not record profits like we saw back in 2014, but still some reason to be optimistic about the hog industry. They've had some good years here recently and potential to have some more here in 2019. Moving on to beef, we're going to talk about cow-calf here for a second. The U.S. herd is rebuilding and growing. We're seeing some growth in Canada. We're thinking it's probably going to plateau in about 12 to 18 months here. Futures prices are a bit lower, and feed costs have really diminished the outlook for the fall calf prices. And there's potential for modest profit margins, although given the drought, obviously it affected the grain side. It affects hay and pasture as well. So we're seeing more cattle coming to market sooner, and that's driving prices down to a certain extent. So beef numbers have declined over the recent years. We're starting to see those stabilize and move up a bit. So we're building the herd a bit, and we'll see if demand can sort of match the supply that Canada's starting to put out. In this slide, we're really just showing returns on a cow-calf operation. We've seen some good returns in recent years. This year is going to be a bit tougher, I think, for guys they're coming to a decision here whether they either decrease their herds or they're going to look at potentially having to buy feed down the road. Predominantly, we're talking Saskatchewan, Alberta here, where the drought is happening. So some potential impacts there, and guys are going to have to make some decisions as they're starting to pull cows off of pasture and take things to market. They'll have to make those decisions. On the feedlot side, we're setting production records, but we're also seeing softening prices for cattle, and compounded by some higher feed prices. Both of those things are starting to squeeze profit margins. Again, demand has been the key to stabilizing the market, and we'll have to wait and see if demand can continue to support those growing supplies. And if we look at profit margins here for yearling steers and Alberta fed steers, we've seen some guys being profitable and then not so profitable, and as we move forward here, it looks like we're going to be pretty close to break even for a while. So interesting times on the feedlot market.
Moving on to the winery industry. Update on the Como case that we told you about back in the spring, where the provinces were challenging that BC had the right to sort of restrict the inter-provincial trade. And the resolution of that case was that it's just in a holding pattern, so there was no change there. So it's not really harmful or helpful. But as much as we might have free trade with other countries, we don't always have free trade, I guess, within our provinces. Consolidation is expected to continue. 2017 we saw a pretty high volume of consolidation in the industry, lots of mergers and acquisitions. This year we're seeing that start to slow down. It's still happening, but at a lower level. The industry really does keep growing and continue to expand and receiving lots of global recognition, so that's good for all the Canadian brands out there. USMCA, obviously we have to talk about that. It did affect the winery industry as well. Currently, BC grocery stores were restricting other wines coming in on the grocery store shelves. And so with the USMCA coming into effect at some point in the future, BC grocery stores are going to have to drop that, and they're going to have to allow U.S. wines in as well on grocery store shelves. So that'll increase some competition already. Increase some competition, but that competition was to a certain extent there already. So the other trend that we're kind of seeing is land prices. In interior BC, we're hearing $200,000 to $250,000 per acre. So as land prices are kind of creeping up, it really is making it more difficult for your smaller wineries to compete and acquire those essential capital assets that they need in order to grow. Moving on to marijuana. We're seeing profit margins starting to get a bit squeezed as that product really does turn into or is turning into a commodity. So growers are definitely looking at prices falling, and likely the impact of that is we're going to see a little bit more consolidation in the industry as everyone's trying to find the floor price there for prices. Canada as a whole is I think staged fairly well. They've been in the hemp market for quite a while, so lots of the infrastructure is in place already, so they should have a good competitive advantage when it comes to that. The other sort of trend that we're seeing here is sort of conversion of food and beverage and cannabis. So we're seeing joint ventures starting to happen in order to build food-based cannabis products, which looks like it's going to be a really big opportunity going forward in that market space. Moving on to food and beverage. Health and wellness really is a big trend that's happening in that industry. Traceability, I think, is probably a key word that's being used a lot. People are really wanting to know what they ate, where it came from, how it's made, and then even looking at environmental sustainability of the companies that are producing it, ethical considerations, all that sort of thing. So that industry is really trying to become more transparent to meet that consumer demand, and kind of flows back into some of the previous commodities that we talked about, where it's from farm to plate, so that consumers can see exactly where food is coming from, and all on a very transparent basis. So another consideration is country of origin. The United States has become very much protectionist, and so in this industry we're seeing that quite a bit, where they really want the made in America, and that's something obviously that the Canadian industry has to compete with. So we're starting to see some companies be a bit nervous about that. And really, you know, there's been a lot of the industry has been built on a foreign exchange advantage, and that's allowed them to compete with the American products. And so a bunch of the industry has been built around a low Canadian dollar versus the U.S.
John, I'm so sorry. I'm going to interrupt you right away. Your slides aren't changing through to, like, I think we're still stuck on wineries.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's fine. So we're just probably going to get you to start at marijuana, and then you can continue from there.
Okay. That was
sorry about that. Sorry to cut you off.
Okay, good thing we're doing a pause in between, I guess.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and you can just do another 10-second pause just as soon as we mute ourselves, and then you're good to go from there.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
Moving on to the marijuana industry, we're seeing profit margins in that area start to get squeezed a bit as we've seen legalization happen here in Canada. We're seeing a lot of the product turn into more of a commodity versus a niche product, and as part of that, we're seeing prices falling. Growers are starting to get squeezed from that side, so we expect there could be some consolidation happening as the industry is really trying to find that bottom price for their product. The other trend that we're kind of seeing is a few more joint ventures between food and beverage and the marijuana industry. We're looking at building food-based marijuana products, which seems to be the next trend that's coming along. So that is something to look out for as those products are developed around the world and here in Canada, and so we see that as another trend as well. You know, Canada has been in the hemp and cannabis market for decades, so we do feel that Canada's got a lot of the infrastructure built already that other countries might not have at this point, so we should have a competitive advantage from that standpoint. Moving on to food and beverage, one of the trends that we're seeing in this industry obviously is a continuation with health and wellness being a real hot topic. Consumers are really looking for traceability in their food and looking for a lot of transparency in what they eat. They're looking for kind of what they ate, where it came from, and how it's made. And beyond that, even looking at environmental sustainability of the companies or the farms where it's coming from, and ethics is also a big consideration. So that's a trend that we've seen in the past and is continuing on from that standpoint. Country of origin is another hot topic, I guess, with the U.S. very much speaking language around protectionism and made in America. That's getting some companies here in Canada nervous. They definitely serve a big U.S. market, so anytime that the Americans are looking to buy more from America versus Canada, that is a potential threat to the industry. A lot of companies and facilities have been built around the foreign exchange advantage that we're currently seeing, so that is another industry, I guess, that's impacted by that foreign exchange. And given the historical lower Canadian dollar versus the U.S. allowed the industry to grow and flourish under that, and so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out over the next while.
Thank you very much, John, for your informative presentation. As always, we want to thank everyone for their participation in this webinar, and we would encourage you to contact John or any of our farm management consulting practitioners directly with any specific agricultural questions, or call me regarding any insolvency issues. The appendix to today's presentation includes further information about MMP and our farm management consulting group. Please feel free to forward the presentation to your colleagues. Should your colleagues wish to be added to our distribution list, they should send me their request by email. We look forward to your participation at our Spring 2019 webinar. Thank you and have a great winter.